The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a celebration of love and unity, but for Isla Jane, it felt more like an audition she had no chance of winning. She sat beside her husband Ron in the softly lit dining hall, surrounded by the gentle clinking of glasses and the low hum of polite conversation. Yet the tension between her and Marina, Ron's daughter, was a silent undercurrent threatening to pull them all under. Marina was the picture of poised elegance in a sleek emerald dress that caught the light with every movement, her laughter ringing out as she charmed the guests. But every glance she sent Isla's way was a dagger wrapped in silk. Isla tried to focus on the flickering candles and the warm scent of roasted chicken and rosemary, but she couldn't ignore the cold edge in Marina's eyes. Ron, ever the peacekeeper, squeezed Isla's hand under the table, offering a faint smile that did little to soothe her nerves. Isla's heart ached at the memory of her early days in this family, how she'd arrived with open arms and hopeful eyes, only to find herself shut out by Marina's icy reserve. She had always believed time and kindness would bridge the gap, but tonight those hopes seemed more fragile than ever. As Marina stood to toast the couple's future, her voice was clear and confident. "I want to address something that's been weighing on me." She began, her eyes locking onto Isla, with a hint of cruelty that made Isla's blood run cold. In that moment, Isla realized this night would be far from the warm, joyful gathering she'd envisioned. It was a reckoning she had never seen coming. Marina's words hung in the air like a bomb, waiting to go off, each syllable echoing in Isla Jane's mind, as if she were trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The warm glow of the dining hall had vanished, replaced by a cold, brittle silence that made the clinking of forks on china sound like nails on a coffin. Marina's eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction as she slowly lowered her glass, the corners of her lips curving in a smirk that only Isla seemed to notice. "You may call yourself my stepmother," Marina continued, her voice low and measured, "but to me, you're nothing more than a stranger trying to wedge herself into a family that doesn't need you." Isla felt the sting of those words in her chest, sharp and slicing through the fragile sense of belonging she had spent years trying to build. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room shift in her direction, some wide with shock, others narrowing with thinly veiled curiosity. Ron's hand, still resting on hers, went rigid, his knuckles turning white as he fought to keep his composure. "Marina!" he said, his voice low and warning, "This isn't the time." "Oh, but it is, Dad!" She shot back, her tone dripping with venom. "It's long past time. I'm tired of pretending this woman has any place in our lives." Isla wanted to shrink back, to disappear under the weight of the shame and betrayal that threatened to suffocate her. But she forced herself to hold her head high, meeting Marina's icy gaze with as much steadiness as she could muster. "Please," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "Let's not do this here. This is supposed to be a happy occasion." Marina's laugh was a bitter, hollow sound that cut through the room like a blade. "Happy for who you with your fake smiles and your desperate attempts to play house. You're nothing but an outsider, and you always will be." A hush fell over the crowd, the only sounds the crackle of the fireplace and the distant music drifting from the other room. Isla's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to let Marina see her break. She had spent too long trying to be strong, to be the glue that held this fractured family together. She wouldn't let Marina reduce her to a sobbing wreck. Ron stood his chair, scraping sharply against the hardwood floor. "That's enough," he said, his voice tight with anger. "We're leaving." Marina just shrugged, a dismissive wave of her hand as she turned away. "Do what you want," she said coolly. "Just don't expect me to pretend anymore." As Ron and Isla made their way to the exit, the weight of 100 curious stares pressing down on them, Isla felt her heart shatter in slow motion. She had come here tonight, hoping to celebrate a new beginning for Marina, to be part of a moment that should have been about love and promise. Instead, she found herself walking out of the dining hall, feeling like an unwelcome guest at her own family's gathering. In the car, the tension was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Ron gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were bone white. His jaw clenched as he stared straight ahead. "I don't know what's gotten into her," he said finally, his voice ragged. But I swear to you, Isla, I won't let her keep hurting you like this. Isla turned her face to the window, watching the shadows of the passing trees blur together into a dark, endless tunnel. She wanted to believe him, to trust that his promises could keep her safe from the venom that Marina had unleashed. But deep down, she knew that this was only the beginning. Marina's hatred wasn't new, nor was it a sudden eruption of anger. It was a slow-burning fire that had been stoked for years, fed by the poison of her mother's whispered lies. Isla remembered the first time she met Clara, how the woman's bright smile had never quite reached her eyes. "Don't worry, sweetheart," Clara had murmured to Marina, her perfectly manicured nails brushing through her daughter's hair like a queen bestowing a blessing. "No one will ever take my place in your heart." Even then, Isla had sensed the undercurrent of malice beneath the sugary sweetness. She had tried to ignore it, to believe that love and patience would win out in the end. But every time she tried to reach out to Marina, she was met with a wall of icy indifference. At first, Marina had been polite enough, her words measured, and her demeanor cold, but civil. Isla had thought that with time, she could chip away at that distance, build a bridge between them, brick by brick. But as the months turned into years, Marina's mask began to crack. It started with little things, an eye roll here, a snide comment there. Isla tried to brush them off, to tell herself that Marina was just testing boundaries, adjusting to a new family dynamic. But the insults grew sharper, the distance wider, until it felt like every interaction was a battlefield. One evening, Isla had asked Marina what her plans were for the weekend, her voice light and hopeful. Marina's response was a sneer that cut Isla to the bone. "Why are you always trying to butt into my life?" she snapped. "You're not my mother, and you never will be." Ron had tried to intervene, his voice low and pleading. "Marina, don't talk to her like that. She's just trying to be kind." But Marina's eyes had flashed with fury. "Kind," she spat. "She's a fraud, and I'm sick of pretending otherwise." From that night on, Marina's disdain became an open wound, festering and infecting every corner of their family life. She would roll her eyes whenever Isla entered a room, her voice dripping with scorn whenever she deigned to speak to her. Offers of help were met with biting sarcasm, simple questions twisted into accusations. "You're not fooling anyone with your phony concern," Marina had sneered one afternoon as Isla offered her a ride. Isla had stood there, feeling the weight of Marina's contempt, like a stone pressing on her chest. Ron's attempts to mediate only made things worse, his frustration growing as he tried to juggle the roles of father and husband, always caught in the crossfire. And always in the background, Clara lurked like a specter, her saccharine smile a mask for the cruelty she delighted in sowing. "I don't know what you've done to turn my daughter against you," she would purr during her unwelcome visits, her eyes glinting with malice. "But I suppose you'll have to live with the consequences." Those words echoed in Isla's mind as she lay awake at night, her thoughts a tangle of doubt and fear. Was she really the problem? Was there something broken in her that made it impossible for Marina to accept her? But even as the doubts crept in, a small, stubborn flame of resolve burned brighter. She had tried kindness. She had tried patience. But if Marina wanted to turn this into a war, then Isla would no longer stand by and be the passive victim. She would protect the family she had built with Ron, even if it meant facing the darkness head-on. Marina's public humiliation tonight had been the final straw, and as Isla watched the moonlight flicker across Ron's tired face, she made a silent promise to herself. She would not let Marina's poison define who she was, and she would not let this betrayal be the end of her story. As the days turned into weeks after that fateful rehearsal dinner, the weight of Marina's words clung to Isla Jane like a second skin she couldn't shed. The wound was raw, festering with each cold glance and every passive-aggressive comment that followed. Isla had always believed that kindness would eventually bridge the gap between her and Marina, that the warmth of her heart would eventually thaw the girl's icy demeanor. But it was becoming painfully clear that she'd been fighting a losing battle against an enemy she hadn't fully understood, an enemy who wore the face of a daughter, but wielded the manipulative cunning of someone far more dangerous. The weekend after the dinner, Isla found herself in the kitchen, brewing coffee to chase away the dull ache of another sleepless night. She could hear Marina's laughter drifting down the hallway, each note like a dagger digging deeper into the soft flesh of her self-worth. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she poured a mug and carried it into the living room where Ron sat hunched over bills and spreadsheets. He looked up, his eyes heavy with worry, and managed a weary smile. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" he asked softly. "I'm fine," Isla lied, forcing a smile of her own. But as she set the mug down, she caught sight of a figure in the doorway. Marina leaned against the frame, her arms crossed, a smirk playing on her lips. "How sweet," she drawled. "Another one of your little bonding moments, I see." Isla stiffened, feeling the words like a slap to her cheek. "Marina, please," she started. But Marina cut her off with a flick of her wrist. "Save it!" She snapped, her eyes glinting with contempt. "I don't need your fake concern or your desperate attempts to act like you belong here." Ron sighed, the lines in his forehead deepening as he pushed his chair back and rose to his feet. "Marina, that's enough. She's trying to help." Marina's laugh was brittle and sharp, echoing off the walls of the cozy room Isla had worked so hard to make warm and inviting. "She's nothing but a parasite feeding off your pity." Isla's chest tightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides as she fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. She had always known that Marina's resentment ran deep, but the venom in her voice now was something new, something more vicious than she'd ever dared imagine. Ron's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. "Marina," he said finally, his voice low and strained, "this has to stop. You're tearing this family apart." But Marina's lips only curled into a smirk. "Oh, I'm tearing it apart," she echoed mockingly. "Funny how you're so quick to blame me when she's the one who's been trying to worm her way in from the start." Isla took a step forward, her heart hammering in her chest. "I've never tried to replace your mother, Marina. I just wanted us to be a family." Marina's eyes narrowed, the smirk fading as she pushed herself away from the doorframe and stalked closer, her finger jabbing into Isla's shoulder. "You're not my family," she hissed, her voice so low it was almost a growl. "And you never will be." The words sank into Isla's skin like ice water, chilling her to the bone. She took a step back, her mind reeling as she tried to process the depth of Marina's hatred. In that moment, something inside her shifted. The hurt was still there, raw and bleeding, but beneath it was a growing ember of resolve, a quiet fury that refused to be extinguished. The confrontation became a turning point, a crack in the facade that had held Isla captive for so long. She realized then that no amount of kindness or patience would ever change Marina's heart, not while Clara's poisonous influence loomed like a shadow over their lives. The next day, Isla found herself alone in the house, the silence heavy and oppressive. She wandered from room to room, each carefully curated corner, a testament to her determination to create a home, not just a house. She paused at the framed photographs on the mantel, smiling faces from happier times. Ron's arm wrapped protectively around her waist. Marina's forced smile, betraying nothing of the seething anger beneath. Isla pressed her fingers to the glass, feeling a pang of loss for the family she'd tried so hard to build. It was in that quiet moment that Marina reappeared, her presence like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. "I need to talk to you," she said bluntly, her tone clipped and businesslike. Isla turned, her expression wary. "About what?" Marina's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. "About how you're going to make this right." Isla's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" Marina crossed the room, her gaze cold and calculating. "I want $5,000, she said, her voice as calm as if she were asking for a cup of sugar. "And if you don't give it to me, I'll make sure everyone knows just how fake you really are." Isla's breath caught in her throat, her pulse roaring in her ears. "What?" she whispered, incredulous. "Where is this coming from? I've tried everything to save it." Marina spat, her eyes flashing with a dangerous gleam. "You think you're so perfect, so high and mighty with your little job at the school and your precious image. But I know the truth, Isla. I know the cracks in your perfect little world. The words hit Isla like a physical blow, but she forced herself to stand tall, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. I don't have that kind of money, she said quietly. And even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you. I won't let you blackmail me. Marina's smile was all teeth, predatory and cold. Then you'd better start thinking of how you're going to get it, she said softly, leaning in so close Isla could feel the heat of her breath. Because if you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what a fraud you really are. Isla felt the walls of her carefully built world tremble, but she refused to let them fall. She watched as Marina turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the house. She knew then that this was more than just a family squabble, it was a war, and Marina was willing to do whatever it took to win. Later that night, Isla sat at the kitchen table, the dim light casting long shadows across the worn wood. Ron sat across from her, his face drawn and weary as she told him what had happened. She wants to destroy us, Ron, she said, her voice low and heavy with the weight of the truth. She wants to tear this family apart piece by piece. Ron scrubbed a hand over his face, his shoulders sagging with the burden of it all. What are we going to do? He asked, his voice hollow. Isla met his gaze, her eyes hard, with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. We're going to stand our ground, she said quietly. We're not going to let her win. The words were a promise, a vow forged in the crucible of betrayal and heartbreak. And as she spoke them, Isla felt something shift inside her, an unbreakable core of steel that Marina would never touch. She knew the road ahead would be hard, that Marina would not back down easily. But for the first time, Isla felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could weather this storm and come out stronger on the other side. The night after Marina's brazen demand for money, Isla Jane lay awake in the darkness, her mind a restless sea of swirling doubts and simmering resolve. The betrayal had settled deep in her bones, an ache she couldn't shake no matter how tightly she wrapped the blankets around her. She knew she couldn't bend to Marina's threats. It would only feed the girl's sense of power and entitlement, but the fear of what she might do next clawed at the edges of Isla's resolve, like a persistent, gnawing hunger. Ron slept fitfully beside her, tossing and turning, as if his dreams were haunted by the same specter that stalked her waking hours. In the cold hush of their room, Isla traced the faint lines on his face, with her eyes thinking of the man she had fallen in love, with the man she had built this life with. She owed it to him and to herself to find the strength to fight back, no matter how much it hurt. The next morning dawned with the kind of quiet chill that seemed to seep into her bones. Isla moved through the motions of her day with mechanical precision, brewing coffee, straightening the living room, checking the garden she'd once tended with such care. But every smile felt forced, every word a careful dance around the jagged edge of her new reality. She could feel Marina's eyes on her whenever they crossed paths in the house, each glance a silent dare, a challenge Isla refused to meet head-on. She had tried for too long to be the peacemaker, to be the gentle bridge between father and daughter. But Marina had turned that kindness into a weapon, and Isla knew she couldn't keep playing the same losing game. It was late that afternoon, as Isla stood in the grocery store, comparing the price of apples in the produce aisle, that fate intervened in the form of a familiar voice, one she hadn't heard in years. Isla. She turned startled to see a tall man with tousled dark hair and a hesitant smile. His name tumbled from her lips like a memory. Derek. They had met years ago, back when Marina was still in college, and Derek had been the boy who made her smile in ways Isla had never seen. Back then, Isla had thought maybe Derek was the key to softening Marina's sharp edges, that love might do what patience and gentleness had failed to accomplish. But like everything else with Marina, it had ended in bitterness and ruin. Now, seeing Derek standing there in the grocery store under the bright fluorescent lights, Isla felt a jolt of something she couldn't quite name, relief maybe, or the first flutter of hope in weeks. It's been a long time, she said softly, managing a small smile. Derek's expression was a mixture of shame and uncertainty. Yeah. Too long, probably. How have you been? Isla hesitated. It's complicated, she admitted, her voice low. Derek nodded as if he understood all too well. I heard about the wedding, he said carefully. Marina always did have a way of making sure everyone knew her business. Isla gave a hollow laugh. Yes, well, it's turning out to be more complicated than we ever imagined. Derek's gaze sharpened a flicker of something dark and sad in his eyes. I know. That's actually why I wanted to talk to you. Isla blinked, taken aback. What do you mean? He shifted closer, lowering his voice, as if the weight of his words could shatter them both. I know what she's been saying about you, about Ron. She did the same thing to me, Isla. She spun her little stories, made me believe you were some controlling, manipulative woman, trying to replace her mother, that Ron was this tyrant. She was so convincing I didn't even question it. Not until it was too late. Isla felt her breath catch in her throat. You believed her? Derek's shoulders slumped, a pained look in his eyes. I did. For a while, anyway. But after we broke up, I started to see things for what they really were. She's been playing everyone, Isla. You're not the problem, she is. Isla felt the words like a balm on her battered heart, soothing, but also sharpening the pain she'd been carrying. I always suspected, she murmured. But hearing you say it, it makes it real. Derek nodded. I should have come forward sooner. I'm sorry. She reached out her hand, trembling as she touched his arm. No. You're here now, and that's what matters. He looked at her, then really looked, and she saw the flicker of resolve that had been missing in his eyes before. There's more, he said quietly. Marina isn't marrying Kevin because she loves him. She's using him just like she used me. She thinks once she's got her hooks in, she'll be set for life. But she doesn't care about him. She never did. Isla swallowed hard, the pieces of the puzzle snapping into place with a sickening finality. How do you know? Derek pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly, before holding it out to her. I saved everything, he said grimly. The texts, the voicemails. She bragged about it, how easy it was to fool him, how she was just waiting for the wedding so she could start bleeding him dry. Isla stared at the screen, the words blurring together, as the truth became undeniable. The pit in her stomach grew heavier, but with it came a surge of clarity. I need those, she said, her voice steady, despite the storm raging inside her. I need to show Ron. I need to show everyone. Derek nodded, his face set in grim determination. I'll send them to you. But be careful, Isla. Marina, she's not going to go down easy. Isla felt a shiver run down her spine, but she lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with unwavering resolve. Neither am I. When they parted ways outside the store, Isla felt a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in weeks. She had been living in the dark for so long, but now she had something Marina could never steal from her, the truth. That night, Isla sat with Ron at the kitchen table, the glow of the overhead light warm against the cold dread that still lingered in the corners of her mind. She showed him the messages, the recordings, each word a nail in the coffin of Marina's carefully constructed lies. Ron's face was pale as he read them, his hands trembling slightly as he set the phone down. All this time, he said hoarsely, I thought I was failing her, failing you. But it was her. It was always her. Isla reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. You weren't failing anyone. She made us believe we were the problem because that's how she kept control. Ron's eyes met hers, and for the first time in weeks, she saw a spark of the man she had fallen in love with, a man willing to fight for what mattered most. What do we do now? He asked, his voice low. Isla drew a deep breath, her heart pounding with a fierce, steady rhythm. We fight back, she said simply. We stand up and we show her that her lies won't work anymore. In that moment, Isla knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Marina would lash out, would try to twist the truth into something unrecognizable. But with Derek's revelations and the quiet, unbreakable bond she shared with Ron, Isla felt stronger than she had in years. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, she was ready to fight on her own terms. The morning of Marina's wedding dawned with a brittle calm, the kind that often comes before a storm. Isla Jane stood at the edge of her bed, her fingers trailing over the delicate lace of the dress she had chosen for the day, a soft blue that had always brought out the warmth in her eyes, a color she'd hoped would speak of peace rather than conflict. But as she stared at her reflection in the mirror, she knew there would be no peace today. The truth Derek had shared burned bright in her mind, each text and voicemail, a testament to the lengths Marina was willing to go to secure her place in a world built on lies. Isla had spent the night poring over every word, her resolve hardening with each fresh wave of disgust and betrayal. She would not let this day end in more illusions. Today, she would bring the truth into the light, no matter the cost. Downstairs, the house was already a flurry of movement. Florists darted in and out, their arms laden with pale roses and trailing ivy. The scent of fresh blooms hung heavy in the air, a cloying sweetness that did nothing to mask the cold, sharp edge of tension that crackled like static in every corner. Marina swept through the chaos like a queen, holding court, her satin robe billowing around her as she barked orders to the wedding planner and fussed with the veil that Clara adjusted with practiced precision. Isla watched from the doorway, her presence unnoticed, a silent witness to the final performance of the girl she had tried so hard to love. Clara's voice floated to her on the air saccharine and coaxing as she smoothed Marina's hair. "You look beautiful, darling," she murmured, her fingers deft and precise. "Just like a princess." Marina preened under the praise, her lips curving into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mother," she said, her voice light and airy. Isla's throat tightened. She could see it all so clearly now, the performance, the manipulation, the carefully constructed facade that had kept her off balance for years. She wondered, not for the first time, if Marina had ever really been that sweet girl Ron remembered from her childhood, or if she had always been a creation of Clara's relentless ambition. As the guests began to arrive, Isla felt the weight of their stares, each one a silent question she had no answer for yet. She moved through the crowded rooms with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her. Her mind focused on the words she would say when the time came. She had rehearsed them over and over in the quiet hours of the night, shaping them into a blade sharp enough to cut through Marina's web of deceit. The ceremony was set in a small chapel on the edge of town, its whitewashed walls and stained glass windows lending an air of timeless beauty to a day Isla suspected would be remembered for very different reasons. She took her seat near the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap as Marina glided down the aisle on her father's arm. Ron's face was pale, his jaw set in a grim line as he guided his daughter to the altar. He glanced at Isla as he passed, his eyes dark with a silent apology she could feel deep in her bones. She gave him the smallest of nods, a silent promise that she was ready, that they would face whatever came next together. Marina stood at the altar, radiant in her white dress, her smile bright and brittle as she took Kevin's hands in hers. Kevin looked dazed, his eyes fixed on Marina as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. Isla's heart ached for him, a good man, kind and trusting, caught in a snare he couldn't see. The minister began to speak, his voice a soothing murmur that flowed over the assembled guests like a balm. But Isla barely heard the words. Her mind was a litany of everything she had learned, every lie Marina had told, every calculated betrayal that had led them to this moment. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, her palms slick with sweat, but she forced herself to breathe, to stay grounded. When the minister paused, inviting anyone with objections to speak now, or forever hold their peace, Isla rose to her feet. The hush that fell over the chapel was absolute, the air charged with sudden electric tension. Marina's head snapped around her eyes, narrowing as they locked on Isla. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice a sharp whisper that carried through the stillness. Isla drew a deep breath, her voice steady and clear as she spoke. "I'm sorry, but I can't stay silent any longer," she said, her words ringing out in the hush. "This wedding cannot go on." A collective gasp swept through the room, a ripple of shock that cracked the fragile veneer of perfect celebration. Kevin's brow furrowed in confusion, his fingers tightening around Marina's as he turned to Isla. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice low and pleading. Isla took a step forward, her chin lifting as she met his gaze. Kevin, I'm sorry you have to hear this today, she said softly, but you deserve to know the truth. She pulled her phone from her clutch, her hands trembling only slightly as she opened the files Derek had shared. Marina has been lying to you. To all of us. She doesn't love you. She never did. She's using you, manipulating you, just like she's done to everyone in this family. The words landed like blows in the stillness, each one punctuated by the faint, sickening gasp of realization from the guests around them. Kevin's face went white, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as Marina's fingers dug into his arm, her nails leaving angry red crescents in his skin. She's lying! Marina spat, her voice shrill with panic. She's just jealous. She's always been jealous. But Isla didn't falter. She played the recordings, each word from Marina's own mouth, echoing through the chapel like the tolling of a funeral bell. Kevin's shoulders sagged, the last of his hope bleeding away, as the truth became undeniable. Clara stood frozen beside the altar, her face pale and stricken as she watched the house of cards she had built for her daughter come crashing down. Isla met her gaze for the briefest of moments, seeing the cold fury there, the desperate calculation, as Clara realized her empire was crumbling. But there was no satisfaction in it for Isla, only a deep, aching sorrow for the years they had all lost to Marina's games. When the last recording ended, the silence that followed was deafening. Marina's shoulders slumped, her eyes darting from face to face as the weight of her own lies pressed in from every side. Kevin, she said, her voice trembling now, please. You have to believe me. But Kevin stepped back, his expression one of heartbreak and quiet resolve. I think I've heard enough, he said softly, his voice like the final note of a requiem. As he turned and walked away, Marina's composure shattered, a low, broken sob tearing from her lips. The guests watched in stunned silence, their whispers like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. Isla took a slow breath, her shoulders squaring as she met Marina's tear-filled gaze. This was never about destroying you, she said quietly. It was about the truth. It always has been. And with that, she turned and walked out of the chapel, the cold morning air washing over her like a baptism, cleansing her of the weight of all the lies that had come before. She knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt like she could breathe again. The aftermath of Isla's revelation unfolded like a slow-motion car crash, each moment dragging out with excruciating clarity. She could still hear the echo of her voice ringing in the chapel, see the shock and horror on the faces of the guests as the truth shattered Marina's carefully constructed world. But as Isla stepped outside into the cold spring air, the weight of it all began to settle in her chest like a stone. She drew in a deep breath, the crisp air a sharp contrast to the suffocating tension she had left behind. For a moment she simply stood there, letting the cool breeze wash over her, her eyes closed as she tried to steady her racing heart. It was done. She had spoken the truth. She had torn down the facade Marina and Clara had spent years building. And yet there was no triumph in it, only a hollow ache, a bittersweet relief that tasted like ashes on her tongue. Ron found her there a few minutes later, his steps slow and measured as he approached. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with red, but there was a quiet strength in his expression that made her heart clench. Isla, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. I don't even know what to say. She turned to face him, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. You don't have to say anything, she said gently. I didn't do it for me. I did it because the lies had to end. He nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging as he reached out to take her hand in his. I know, he said, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. And I'm so sorry for all of it. She squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch steady her trembling resolve. We can't change what's happened, she said quietly, but we can decide what happens next. Ron's eyes searched hers, the lines of worry and heartbreak etched deep into his features. What do we do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isla took a breath, her mind already working through the possibilities. We start by being honest with ourselves and with each other. We can't let Marina's lies define us anymore. He nodded, his expression resolute. I want that too. I want us to move forward together. She smiled then, a small, weary smile that felt like the first real one she'd managed in weeks. Then that's what we'll do. But even as they stood there, the church behind them, still echoing with the fallout of the truth, Isla knew that moving forward wouldn't be easy. Marina's betrayal had left scars that wouldn't fade overnight, and there would always be those who questioned her motives, who wondered if she had gone too far. She could see it already in the way some of the guests had looked at her as she walked out, pity in their eyes, but also something else, something that felt like fear. Because in exposing Marina, Isla had become something they couldn't ignore, a woman who refused to be silenced, who had chosen truth over comfort, no matter the cost. In the days that followed, that choice would become both her shield and her burden. Word of what had happened at the wedding spread quickly, the story twisting and turning as it traveled through the small town like wildfire. Some people called her brave, a hero, for standing up to the lies that had poisoned her family. Others whispered that she had ruined a young woman's life, that she had taken a private family matter and made it a public spectacle. Isla tried not to let those voices touch her. She focused instead on the quiet moments with Ron, the long walks they took in the evening, the simple dinners they shared at the kitchen table, the way his hand found hers in the dark, as they lay in bed, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next together. And yet, even in those moments of peace, there were reminders of all they had lost. She would catch herself glancing at the empty chair at the dining table, remembering the girl she had once tried so hard to love. She would hear laughter in the distance and feel a pang of longing for the family she had hoped to build, the family that had never been more than a fragile illusion. For Marina, the consequences of her deception came swiftly and without mercy. Her so-called friends drifted away, unwilling to be associated with the scandal that clung to her like a second skin. Kevin's family cut ties completely, their polite words and cold smiles, making it clear that Marina was no longer welcome in their lives. Even Clara, who had always been her fiercest defender, began to distance herself, her icy composure cracking under the weight of her daughter's disgrace. Isla heard about it all in whispers and rumors, each new piece of gossip a reminder of just how thoroughly Marina's world had crumbled. But there was no satisfaction in it, for her only a quiet sorrow for the girl who had chosen lies over love, manipulation over trust. One evening, about a week after the wedding, there was a knock at the door. Isla answered it to find Marina standing on the porch, her hair in disarray, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She looked smaller somehow, her shoulders hunched as if the weight of her own choices had finally become too much to bear. "Can we talk?" Marina asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Isla hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She wanted to slam the door in Marina's face, to shut her out the way she had once shut out Isla's kindness. But she also saw the flicker of something in those tired eyes, something that looked like regret, like a plea for forgiveness she didn't know how to ask for. She stepped aside, letting Marina in. They sat at the kitchen table in the same seats where so many battles had been fought in silence, the air between them heavy with everything that had gone unsaid for far too long. "I didn't come here to fight," Marina said quietly, her hands twisting in her lap. "I know I've done terrible things. I don't know who I am anymore." Isla listened in silence, her heart aching with a mixture of pity and wariness. "I don't know if you're ready to hear this," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm. "But the only person who can decide who you are is you. The lies, the manipulation, they don't have to define you, but it's up to you to change." Marina looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Do you really believe that?" Isla reached across the table, her fingers brushing against Marina's, for the briefest of moments. "I have to," she said softly. "For both of us." In that moment, there was no forgiveness, no sudden healing of old wounds. But there was a crack in the armor, a glimmer of something that might one day become hope. And as Isla watched Marina leave that night, the shadows of the porch light dancing across her face, she realized that this was the real lesson in everything they had been through, that the truth could shatter, but it could also rebuild. That even in the ruins of betrayal, there could still be the faint, stubborn heartbeat of redemption. She didn't know what the future would hold for Marina, or for the family they had both tried and failed to save. But as she turned back into the house, Ron waiting with a quiet smile, she knew one thing for certain: she would keep moving forward. Because that was what survivors did. They learned, they healed, and they kept going. And in the quiet strength of that resolve, Isla Jane found a peace she had never known before. In the weeks that followed, the dust of Marina's exposed lies began to settle, leaving behind a new and fragile calm. Isla Jane moved through each day with a quiet resolve, her steps measured and her gaze steady as she and Ron pieced their lives back together, one gentle moment at a time. The sharp edges of betrayal still lingered in the corners of their home, like the last echoes of a storm. But Isla found that each breath she took seemed a little lighter, each sunrise a little brighter than the one before. Marina remained a distant shadow in their lives, a specter of what had been and what might one day be redeemed. She had vanished into the margins of the town's gossip, her name spoken in whispers of pity and caution. But she hadn't tried to force her way back in. Isla knew that was a gift in itself, a fragile sign of respect that Marina had never shown her before. She still thought of the girl sometimes, of the flicker of vulnerability she had glimpsed that last night at the kitchen table. She wondered if Marina was finally confronting the truth within herself, or if she was still clinging to the hollow comfort of her mother's ambitions. It didn't really matter anymore. Isla had learned that she couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved, no matter how hard she tried. What mattered now was the life she was reclaiming, one moment of honesty and quiet courage at a time. One afternoon, she and Ron sat together in the garden, the spring air fragrant with the first blooms of the season. He took her hand in his, their fingers lacing together with a new certainty. "I'm proud of you," he said softly, "for standing up for what was right, no matter how hard it was." Isla smiled, her heart swelling with a calm strength she had never known she possessed. "I'm proud of us," she said, "for surviving. In that garden of new beginnings, with the soft sun warming her skin and the man she loved by her side, Isla knew that she had finally found her place. Her story wasn't finished, it was only just beginning. And to anyone out there who has ever been silenced or overshadowed, she had this to say: stand tall. Speak your truth, and never let anyone dim the light of who you truly are.